Good morning, America. Good afternoon, Europe. Thank you all who are joining us here from Washington, New York, Houston, many other cities, as well as from Europe, Paris, London, and many other great places. I'm Dmitry Daniel Glinsky, and it is my honor to welcome you all on behalf of the American Russian Speaking Association for Civil and Human Rights, ARA, and of course, on behalf of our distinguished partners in this event, Transparency International U.S. and Alliance for Vietnam's Democracy. Briefly about our association, it is 11-year-old US-wide network of community activists from several former Soviet countries, including exiles from dictatorship in Russia. Since the regime sent its first troops to Ukraine in 2014, we've been speaking and acting against this invasion, jointly with Ukrainian Americans and on our own. And as this horrific barbaric war is still dragging on, and many of us who have witnessed the rise of the regime from inside Russia, like myself, feel responsible for not fighting hard enough to stop it before it became too late. So I urge all of you here to donate to Ukrainian charities such as Razum for Ukraine that are helping refugees on the ground. Our event today is part of the day-long programming of the Global Democracy Coalition, to which our three organizations belong. Its events today are our collective civil society contribution toward the second Summit for Democracy. The summit process and the commitments made by their participants have been a transformational undertaking for our time, in my opinion. And they were done in response to internal and external threats, especially the immediate threat to American democracy. These threats are still out there, but the response has been by and large successful. And it required a comprehensive revision of some of the doctrines that dominated for 40 years prior. When I made my final move to the United States 20 years ago, most of the world economy was ruled by the so-called Washington Consensus. Privatization, whether democratic and transparent or not so much, was viewed as a treatment of all post-communist ills. The wealth of the few was expected to trickle down and eventually buy democracy and human rights for the rest as living standards increased. Post-Soviet tycoons, with their freshly plundered wealth, were given red carpet in Western capitals. Mr. Putin was welcomed in the White House as partner in the war on terror. The reports by Memorial and other Russian and Western NGOs about the war crimes committed by his army in Chechnya were swept under the rug. And an immigrant from Russia, who like me, was publishing critiques of that consensus, was really seen as a nuisance because Russian funders and deal makers were known to be highly sensitive to value judgments. And if you wanted to work on anything Russia related, you were supposed to adore their money and to help raise it. Now this Washington Consensus is now gone. In its place, we have what I personally would call the Washington Spring, or rather an American Spring. There is more vigorous dialogue between US government and NGOs, big and small, than I've ever seen, including on such inconvenient topics that we'll be discussing today. Since the first summit, quite a bit of good has been done to bring more accountability to the marketplace in the US and abroad. But there is much more that remains to be done, and that we'll be discussing today. In this unfolding debate, some previously silenced voices can now be heard, including, of course, such heavily accented voices like mine and other foreign-born Americans from countries with autocratic regimes, as we gradually look around and find ourselves among the many stakeholders of US policies toward our countries of origin. Now, let me thank our distinguished panelists for their collaboration. My dear friend David Tran and the Alliance for Vietnam's Democracy. Democrats from distant countries have too little awareness of each other's struggles, and this allows autocrats like the Kremlin to spread the lie that people in the global South are not interested in human rights and democracy as understood in the West. Well, our friends from the Alliance prove the opposite by their daily struggle for democracy in Vietnam, a country with its own tragic as well as heroic pages of history. And today we'll be learning from each other and helping amplify each other's voices and reminding all of us that every country matters and the struggle of its citizens to improve it deserves attention. Because as we know from Martin Luther King, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And of course, my very special thanks to Gary Kalman and Transparency International U.S. Transparency International is a pivotal institution of our global civil society, representing a value that very few question openly, and that yet so many resist even in the most developed democracies. In Russia, 20 days ago, TI has joined the long list of distinguished organizations branded as undesirable by the Kremlin. It was declared a threat to the foundations of constitutional order and Russia's security, and its Russian affiliate is now disbanding. But I bet that sooner than later, TI will be viewed as one of the most desirable NGOs in post-war Russia that will need so much help in redeeming and reinventing itself. And I'd like us to dedicate our event to TI Russia and all other fighters against corruption who face repression around the globe. Gary will be our first speaker among the list of those who I'll have the honor of introducing today. He is Executive Director of Transparency International in the U.S. Prior to that, he led the FACT Coalition. The FACT stands for Financial Accountability and Corporate Transparency, and his most recent co-authored article published this month in American Banker is titled just like for our today's event, Russian oligarchs hide money in the U.S.
Thank you, Dmitry. Very much appreciate that introduction, and also want to sort of reiterate the support for our colleagues in Russia and TI chapters, quite frankly, around the world that are right now facing various struggles. I know that a year or so ago, we were involved in trying to help folks in TI Afghanistan leave the country because of concerns about their safety and elsewhere. So proud to be part of this terrific conversation today, and also glad it's we're doing this in honor of Russia and the TI colleagues around the world. So let me start. My colleagues are going to talk a lot more about the influences with think tanks and universities and other ways in which money finds its way into the country to influence public policy. I want to talk about two things to sort of set the stage. One is, just so that we're all on the same page, is to talk a little bit about how money comes into the country in various ways, some of it public, but some of it private. And then the second is to talk about the use of authoritarian governments in hiring U.S. officials, former high-level U.S. officials. It is a growing problem, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But first, on how money comes into the country. So prior to people being sanctioned, or if they are not necessarily seen as a global pariah, but in fact have had, there were concerns in their own country about how they accumulated their wealth, they can put money directly into the country. And as I said, my colleagues will talk a little bit about that. But there's also other ways in which money comes into the country that is very alarming. And that is when the money comes in through secret finance. And I want to spend a minute on how the use of anonymous shell companies has enabled bad actors from around the world to put money into the United States. In fact, Janet Yellen, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, last year testified in front of Congress that the U.S. is arguably the easiest place to launder money in the world. And that comes from a combination of several things. First of all, we provide secrecy. You can set up an anonymous company that no one knows who owns it through an agent or through other anonymous companies in offshore jurisdictions and put money into the United States without any questions being asked. You can buy real estate, you can invest in our private investment markets, and money will come into the United States and no one will know it's there. It's one of the reasons that we had such problems tracking down sanctioned individuals and some of the Russian oligarch money after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So we have taken some steps in the right direction. A couple of years ago, the U.S. Congress passed the Corporate Transparency Act. And starting next year, companies will have to report their, quote, beneficial owner, which is just a term of art, which means who really owns and controls, who's behind the company before you can actually set up a company in the United States. That is one significant step in the right direction. We need to do additional things in terms, including going after or providing enablers of or gatekeepers to the U.S. financial system with anti-money laundering and due diligence responsibilities. Banks, if somebody walks in, they have to find out who that customer is and is it somebody that they should be doing business with. But if you go to a lawyer, an accountant, somebody who sets up a trust for you, none of those questions are being asked, and people are able to inject money into this economy without anyone knowing. Let me flip to another part of the problem that I was going to talk about before, which goes directly to foreign influence. And here, there's growing concerns that former high-level ranking officials in the U.S. government are going to work for governments that we would consider to be either hostile or to raise concerns about their influence in the United States. There was a report that came out that since 2000, at least 90 former members of Congress were registered as foreign agents on behalf of 87 countries. Chinese interests in particular employed a number of those individuals. Several lobbied for a Chinese state-owned company that provides surveillance equipment and that is used to monitor the Uyghur populations. Others lobbied on behalf of an artificial intelligence company. Both companies have been blacklisted by the United States government, and yet members of Congress were working for those governments. We've also had former chairs of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee representing, some of them represented the embassy of Saudi Arabia. They played a critical role in trying to rehabilitate Saudi's reputation after the brutal murder of the Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi. We've seen additional generals and high-ranking military officials put their efforts and get hired by other countries, some of which may not be considered hostile to the United States, some of which may be allies, but still raise issues in terms of what those governments are trying to promote, including various arms sales. We had General Michael Flynn was actually convicted of covert influence peddling for Turkey. Turkish influence enjoyed a deep bench of former lawmakers doing legal work on their behalf, but nonetheless raised some questions. And these included former leader of the Democratic leader of the Senate, Tom Daschle, Representatives Bart Stupak, and a former Speaker of the House, Dick Gephardt. And so those raise a number of issues that we want to begin to take a closer look at. And so there's been several bills that have been introduced or are going to be introduced. We've seen some bills just calling for an outright ban for former senior officials from ever going to work for a foreign government. I think those some of those go pretty far, and it's unclear some of the reach of those bills. However, I think a new bill, bipartisan bill, is being worked on right now in Congress and hopefully will be introduced in the next couple of months, which would take a look at just the very senior officials, the most senior officials, cabinet level secretaries and just below, to say that there's a lifetime ban on them lobbying for what would be a list of hostile countries to the United States, and then extending the bans on them being able to use their influence with their former colleagues for a longer period of time. Right now, we see that bans or restrictions on their able to represent foreign interests is about a year. But a lot of firms, whether it be lobbying firms or other types of law firms, will be willing to put somebody on their payroll for a year to wait out that ban, and then they'll go back and lobby their former colleagues. So we think that we need to extend that. And the questions that we're negotiating right now are whether, is a 3-year restriction long enough? Should we make sure that it's at least one full administration, so you're literally not going back and lobbying your own colleagues that you worked with? There's at least a change in the administration. I think that seems a reasonable amount of time to have some of these restrictions in place. And so we'll see where that goes, but I think that we are beginning to see enough concern coming from former senior officials using their contacts, using their influence, using their knowledge, that we could get something done. The other thing is not actually even direct lobbying, but when you talk about some of the high-level ranking military officials and some folks in certain departments, the Homeland Security and others, they have specific knowledge about U.S. systems, and they will not necessarily be lobbying the U.S. government, but they will hire out their services to foreign governments to share information that might otherwise be considered classified. And so we want to take a look at that as well, and making sure that there are appropriate protocols in place and permissions are given to the extent that it is allowable to make sure that we're not compromising our own security or that of our allies and friends around the world. So let me stop there. That gives you sort of a flavor for how money's coming in and some of the things we are concerned about our U.S. officials going and marketing their influence around the world to influence U.S. policy. Dimitri, let me turn it back to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Gary, very much for this very enlightening and informative remarks that give us a lot of food for thought. And it just came to my mind that what are all of them lobbying for? I doubt any of it is lobbying for human rights and democracy in those countries. Now I'm going to Olga Lautman, who has the distinction of being the only other speaker other than me from New York today. But more importantly, she is Senior Investigative Researcher and International Investigative Coordinator at the Institute for European Integrity and Senior Fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis in Washington. Olga is also the creator and co-host of Kremlin File podcast series and coordinator of the Syria-Ukraine network. And by the way, she is a forensic accountant by training. So you don't want to end up being audited by her, but you do want to listen to her insightful analysis, please.
Thank you, Dimitri. Good morning and afternoon to everyone. And thank you for everyone tuning in. And thank you, Dimitri, for putting this important conversation together. Before I start, I just wanted to highlight the importance of what Gary said, because I monitor Russian news, for a long time, and I am blown away to see how many former CIA and FBI, agents are either giving interviews to Russian press or being used for propaganda inside of Russia. And then you see on the flip side here that they are pushing Kremlin propaganda against U.S. national security risks all day and night. So I think it's a very important issue. And I think with certain positions, certain agencies, that U.S. officials should not even be allowed to lobby. There should be no time limit. They should just not be allowed to lobby for our adversaries over the risk of, helping our adversaries with the tactics and methods that the U.S. uses. And also, we see even, recently in New York, the head of the FBI counterintelligence, who is tasked with stopping Russian intelligence operations against the United States, ended up being on Deripaska's payroll, and Deripaska is one of Putin's, cronies. So thank you, Gary, for bringing that up. It's such an important point. I will focus, because my other colleagues will focus on the United States. I'll talk a little bit about Europe and how Russia's oligarchs and the kleptocracy and corruption intersect with Russia's intelligence operations. So we have all seen the damage to democracies caused by corruption and foreign corrupt influences that have infiltrated Western institutions, which are the foundations of democracy. Over the past decade, we witnessed Russia dispatch its oligarchs to launder money through Western institutions, influence domestic policies, fund division and disinformation operations, move money for Russia to conduct terrorist operations, and that are basically on the behalf of the Kremlin and Russia's intelligence services. And there is a big difference that people don't understand. Every country has wealthy businessmen. And, in the United States, our wealthy businessmen have influence over the politicians. But when it comes to Russia, that wealth is handed to them in exchange for services that they are asked to perform for the state. And in the case with Russia's oligarchs and wealthy businessmen, Putin created these oligarchs. And for them to maintain their wealth, they must carry the task out for the state. If not, they will be simply jailed and have their assets seized. Also, another important point to make is there is virtually a non-existent line in Russia when it comes to the Kremlin, intelligence services, organized crime, and oligarchs. Each of them work together in certain cases in order to conduct operations against the West, plus commit, criminal activities and launder money. And we have seen the influence of Russia's oligarchs, both in Europe and the United States, as they flood elections with dark money and run malign influence operations. Oligarchs are known to use NGOs as vehicles to carry out their operations, launder their reputation, and launder money. I'm currently working on a project for the Institute of European Integrity, and we are building a watch list of NGOs in Europe that are either directly owned or backed by kleptocrats and foreign states. But these influence operations and buying influence doesn't stop at NGOs. Oligarchs and Russia's wealthy businessmen pour money into universities, charities, and political campaigns in their attempts to gain influence over our own society, influence foreign policy towards Russia, and subvert democracies. And we have seen democracies around the globe over the past decade teetering like on the brink. One example I'm going to talk about is Vladimir Yakunin. He is actually, his NGOs are on our watch list. And during the Soviet Union, he was a KGB officer working in an elite department tasked with collecting technology and technological and military secrets from the United States. He was based in the United States in New York. This unit later fell under the responsibility of the SVR, which is Russia's Foreign Intelligence Services. He later became an influential Russian politician and businessman. And after Russia carried out its 2014 illegal annexation of Crimea and occupation of Donbass, Yakunin poured all his focus into setting up and taking control of various NGOs in Germany, in France, and in Greece. His NGO in France actually shared a location with an organization of Russia, which has been labeled as a friend for SVR. And using his NGOs, Yakunin was able to recruit European politicians and businessmen, bring them to Moscow for high-level meetings, bring them to Crimea, and stand on Ukrainian soil to insist that Crimea belongs to Russia, and use their positions in government to attempt to lift sanctions from Russia and obstruct any further accountability over Russia's invasion and other egregious acts, including assassination attempts using chemical weapons on foreign soil. According to the Senate Intel report, Yakunin was also involved in the 2016 election. Another oligarch I want to mention is Dmitry Firtash. Now, this one started working out with the notorious mob boss Semyon Mogilevich. After the United States indicted him in 2014, Firtash, while holed up in Austria and fighting extradition to the United States, set up a few NGOs in Austria and Britain to whitewash his reputation. Again, capture politicians and former high-level people from various government agencies, including defense ministers, and conduct influence operations in European countries, as well as America. Firtash, on behalf of the Kremlin and also seeking to gain influence over U.S. law enforcement to have his charges dropped, also interfered in our 2020 election. Lastly, another one who is still operating to this day is Konstantin Malofeev. He is a Russian billionaire that conducts operations on behalf of Russia through the Orthodox Church and NGOs. Malofeyev has been sanctioned by the United States since 2014 over his role in providing financial and logistical support to annex Crimea and occupy parts of Donbass in Ukraine. Since 2014, Malofeyev has provided money and logistical reports through NGOs and also through shady means into far-right extremist parties across Europe, touching on U.S. also, funded the Le Pen campaign during French elections, has captured far-right politicians in Italy, and carries out division operations in the Balkans to the point that we have watched the Balkans pretty much about to go on fire over the past few years because of his agents who are stationed there. And even with his recent U.S. indictment and sanctions, Malofeyev was able just last week to publish an article peddling Kremlin propaganda in an Italian media outlet. And that is another thing. All these oligarchs, as soon as they set up their NGOs and gain influence over politicians, they also gain influence over local media. And then you see we have it in the United States with Fox News, where we see Sean Hannity and Tucker Carlson continuously peddling Kremlin propaganda against, that basically Russia has not invaded Ukraine and that they are not carrying out war crimes that we are all seeing with our own eyes. So these examples show that Russia's businessmen aren't just compromising Western institutions and then creating an army of enablers for themselves, but they're doing this for the Kremlin. And we have seen the impact it has had on democracies around the globe. There are many measures that can be put into place. After Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine last year, the West finally started implementing more measures and enacting sanctions against Russia's wealthy businessmen and oligarchs. Honestly, it should have never taken this long. We shouldn't have seen a sovereign country go through a full-scale invasion and mass war crimes in order for these measures to be taken. But now they are being taken, and now we have the ability to influence our government officials to push them to continue taking these measures to stop this dark money flowing through our systems. But this needs to be done, and it requires a joint effort by the international community. The West knows where assets are hidden and the methods oligarchs use to move and hide money. Europe and the United States need to work together to locate and seize these assets. Also, there needs to be full transparency in companies that are created to avoid the heavy use of shell companies, which Gary touched upon. And these companies are used to launder money, move money for operations, and obscure ownership. Lastly, many people say that Putin is a master strategist. He definitely is not. But he has been extremely successful of conducting his operations against the West because of the enablers he's able to capture. And these enablers include politicians and lawyers and former defense officials and military and intelligence officials, accountants, lobbyists, bankers. And these people all must be exposed and investigated, especially now that the West has taken such measures to sanction so many. And we have seen these oligarchs continue to use their enablers to try to hide their assets and evade sanctions. I'll stop here and thank you so much, Dimitri, and thank you for everyone who's joining us again.
Thank you, Olga, for this amazing and really alarming presentation. I just want to mention that what these people also doing all these years, and we have observed that they are suffocating the voices of other Russians in the West who don't have their kind of money and who have an agenda that is unacceptable to them. Now we are going to our next speaker, which is Ilya Zaslavsky, who is anti-corruption researcher and head of underminers.info. This is a research project on post-Soviet kleptocracy. He was formerly Russian Associate of the Academy of Leadership of the Royal Institute of International Affairs, Chatham House, and also worked for the Free Russia Foundation. Ilya has co-authored a number of studies and reports on today's topics. And by the way, he also endured quite courageously quite a few brutal legal fights with the oligarchs, both in Russia and later in the US. So he knows what he's talking about firsthand. Ilya, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. And good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm talking here in my private capacity, just as a concerned Russian, Ukrainian, American citizen, naturalized American citizen. And yes, I've been following these topics for over a decade. I agree with everything that Gary and Olga said. Indeed, FARA and other laws are not working really properly in this country. They're easy to circumvent. And Olga is correct that we have a flurry of officials, even from FBI, working for Russian oligarchs. I prefer to call them Kremligarchs because oligarchs can convey a message of some semblance of independence, although in reality, all of their power and money and influence, both inside and outside of Russia, really comes with the help of Kremlin and its intelligence services and organized crime. It's great to be in this panel. And indeed, the war, in a way, the unprovoked aggressive war of Russia against Ukraine sort of brought all of these topics to the forefront. And finally, people managed to speak out about many of the things that Dmitry mentioned that, have been swept under the carpet for decades, not even last decade, but like since this Washington consensus was taking place. And, people are revisiting history, everything about, what the West did in post-Soviet space and whether things could have been done differently on privatization. People are revisiting, attitude towards Ukraine and Russia-centric history of the post-Soviet space. But today we're talking about specifically about Kremligarchic and other Russian state money in Western academic institutions, think tanks, universities, and so forth. And this topic, is important not just because I and many other activists have been concerned, for academic freedom, for issues of, influencing the debate within these institutions. But honestly, it's the problem is much more than just that. It's through these universities, through these donations, so-called philanthropic activity, these Kremligarchs and other agents of Russian kleptocracy, other kleptocracies, they launder their reputation, but they also get access to Western establishment, and they try to co-opt that establishment and get access to strategic deals, to strategic assets, get access to political parties, and they start. Some of them, have been doing donations across the aisle in this country, in UK, and elsewhere. And I'm going to drop one appeal that, and I'm again, I want to repeat, I'm talking here in my individual capacity. So I helped to organize this petition right in a few days after the beginning of the war. And there you can see specific examples of what we've been concerned with. This appeal by Anti-Corruption Action Center in Kiev, signed by very many esteemed people, including then she wasn't yet a Nobel Peace Prize winner, but eventually she became last year, Alexandra Matvichuk and others. We mentioned specific, cases of what we're concerned with. You see it mentions New York University, Boris Jordan Center, a guy who helped Putin to suppress NTV, independent TV channel. It mentions multiple institutions that have taken money from Kremligarch Len Blavatnik. It mentions Columbia University that had ties with Russian state entities And actually, that's one of the few entities that severed those ties, as far as I know. It mentions Kennan Institute of Wilson Center, which gave awards and had cooperation with notorious Kremligarchs Peter Ivan, Mikhail Friedman, Viktor Vekselberg, and Leon Blavatnik. So actually, few weeks after the start of the war, the Kennan Institute, quietly dropped awards to Peter Ivan and Viktor Vekselberg. And its leadership changed, but it's the way how it was, done quietly. I don't think it's good, but at least they did something. I looked at the President's Global Council at NYU just yesterday, and it still has Boris Yordan and Stanislav Polovets as their members. So Boris Yordan, again, is the guy who suppressed an TV channel, and Stanislav Polovets is the person who has worked along with German Hahn and Mikhail Friedman and Peter Ivan, the free sanctioned oligarchs, for many years, and still, he has many ties with them, dating for several decades. So that remains a concern. I will also mention that some of the findings, for this petition were we contributed with our study that we did with Yekaterina Smagli, a prominent Ukrainian expert on these things. We did a report called Kremlin Hybrid Analytica in 2018, and it mentions many of these problems with Russian money in Western institutions. So part of this petition from March last year is based on that report. And one of the problems was deep ties and very weird cooperation with the Moscow Carnegie Center, and also, inviting very many Putin understanders. So some of these things, have been changed. Moscow Carnegie has been essentially disbanded. And I'm not saying all of them, everything that happened there was bad. There were some good people who had to step down many years ago. There were still some good people left who worked there even after pro-Kremlin guys really took control of Moscow Carnegie Center. But this cooperation hasn't been revisited properly. And I was very upset to see that just recently, a few weeks ago, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace here in DC hired Sergei Vakulenko, who just until the beginning of the war was vice president of Gazprom Neft. He was responsible for their strategic affairs. And Vladimir Milov, my friend, who is an economic advisor to Navalny, and some other people were absolutely, amazed and, raised their criticism of this hirement. It's really not appropriate in my view, just because this guy was part of Sergei Vakulenko. He was really part of Russian propaganda machine in the energy sector. Cambridge University is mentioned in our petition from March, obviously for his cooperation with Mitra Firtash. Still, I don't think Cambridge in the university in the UK severed enough ties with this Kremligarch, who is, as far as I know, remains in Austria. So there are many other questions and specific cases here. I can't mention all of them. I'm happy to connect with any of you afterwards, discuss these issues in Q&A and after on. But I'll also mention that this question of with Russian Kremligarchs remains a very divisive issue in Russian diaspora and among experts, working on Russia and what to do with Russia nowadays. Just recently, there was a scandal again with Mikhail Friedman and Peter Ivan trying to gather signatures among leading Russian opposition figures, opposition TV channel, TV Rain, and prominent journalists, to try to remove themselves from EU and UK sanctions. And again, this was completely inappropriate, and some people like Leonid Volkov had to step down from Navalny's team, from heading the anti-corruption foundation. We also, the Anti-Corruption Center in Kyiv did this petition just very recently, saying that this is inappropriate and we should not allow any Kremligarchs to be removed from sanctions until the war ends and reparations are paid. I think I'll end here and give a chance to other speakers to speak. Good to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, this was really great. And I will now piggyback actually on some of the topics that you raised. And I will focus on Alpha Group in my strictly personal capacity. In general, our association does not track oligarchs or deal with individual sanctions, though we campaigned for the Magnitsky Act as the human rights framework for them when it was going through Congress 10 years ago. But what transpired around Alpha in just this past month, and some of this Ilya mentioned, does make it a human rights issue because it has done something that no other oligarchs have done. It has taken advantage of Russia's most vulnerable groups, including human rights defenders and even political prisoners, to recruit them into its laundromat machine. So this will be a dense and complex story, but I will be moving fast. I want just to show something on the screen. So Alpha is a web of companies around the globe owned by a bunch that I will call here Alpha males, because there are no females among their leadership. And they are among the very few oligarchs that predated Putin and stayed at the top to this day. I like Ilya's reasoning about Kremligarchs, but I still call them oligarchs because even though they do not have as much power over the Kremlin as they used to, but their financial power over millions of Russians, over small and medium businesses who need banking and access to the market is overwhelming. Alpha's claim to being special is that formally speaking, they are fully private, which 20 years ago was a music to Western ears. So Mikhail Friedman was, he is the Alpha super male, I would call him, and its founder, he was awarded Golden Plate along with Hillary Clinton and other dignitaries. And a full year after Putin's annexation of Crimea, Piotr Avin, that Ilya mentioned, who led Alpha Bank, got an award from Kennan Institute for Russian Studies in Washington, to which Alpha had given tons of money. My teacher of 25 years ago, and the former director of that institute, Peter Redaway, was the only one to question from the start the wisdom of taking Alpha money, but his warnings were dismissed. Last year, they revoked Avin's award, but not the phrasing, due to sanctions. That is not due to any intrinsic issues with having honored him. So today we have 4 Alpha males under sanctions by major democratic powers as enablers of the Putin's inner circle, except by the US, which only sanctions some of their firms, not the individuals. Of course, Alpha males are fighting the sanctions in court, and they deny any financial or political relationship with the Kremlin. Remember that. So here they are meeting with the boss. Friedman on the left, Avin on the right, both from the Kremlin's website. And Alpha has actively shaped Russia's domestic and foreign policy for longer than Putin did. Some of this forensic evidence is widely known. For example, that Avin, as minister in Russia's first post-Soviet government, essentially helped Putin's rise. Alpha has both hired and supplied top government officials. One of them, Vladislav Surkov, was among the most powerful people around Putin and most responsible for domestic repression and aggression in Ukraine. Other Alpha execs went to the legislature and they all voted for annexations and for war. Before and after Putin's first election, Avin was very vocal in many places, urging him to emulate Augusto Pinochet in Chile and to use totalitarian methods to push through radical economic reform and redeem his promise to make Russia great again. Alpha actively pursued their and the Kremlin's interests in the Middle East, including Iran, Iraq, and Israel. In Israel, they launched $1 million prize at the time of Putin's visit there. The prize was given by Prime Minister Netanyahu to Jewish people in the diaspora that he really needed to be courting. For over 3 years after Putin sent troops to Ukraine, Alpha kept servicing Russia's war industry, and then it declared it would stop doing it to reduce its international risks. And actually going back to something that Olga said, if you look at the award committee for this Genesis Prize in Israel, it assembled all the right-wing politicians, not just from Israel, but also from Italy, from the party of Silvio Berlusconi, one of the closest Putin, the Kremlin regime partners in Italy, as noted by a liberal Jewish newspaper forward. And Alpha also denied banking services to at least some human rights and opposition groups. Alexei Navalny was a notable exception. 10 years ago, when another oppositionist, Sergei Mitrokhin, stated that Alpha supports Navalny, Alpha sued for libel without explicitly denying that support and lost that case. Now, on Alpha's use and abuse of disadvantaged groups. And this will be about some of the communities that I personally belong. First, inside Russia, Friedman and Hahn helped the Kremlin take control of the Russian Jewish Congress, the main Russian partner of Jewish organizations worldwide. When then US State Secretary John Kerry was visiting Israel, RCC, as well as Friedman and Hahn separately, published an open letter to Netanyahu on behalf of 100 famous Russian Jews, urging him not to give in to US pressure on the peace process. And this is just 3 years ago. Russia's foreign minister meets with RCC to praise them for collaboration. In the West, Alpha weaponized philanthropy, setting up Genesis Philanthropy Group that gave millions to UJA and its affiliates in exchange for influence. UJA is the United Jewish Appeal Federation of New York. It's the oldest, the largest, and most respected Jewish philanthropy in the West. Its network of affiliates receives about $200 million per year from New York City budget only. They provide vital services. They were the lifeline for Soviet-era refugees and remain the gatekeeper to any funding for services to Russian-speaking immigrants. Alpha started giving to it when UJA was losing revenue due to the global financial crisis, from which Alpha was bailed out by the Kremlin. What it funded was so-called Russian Jewish identity building, which was the code word for nationalism and insularity. Alpha Money placed some of its enablers on UJA board, and coincidentally, some of its immigrant services were defunded. Those critical of the oligarchs were silenced and locked out of access to UJA and to community media. And that was something that I personally had to observe. For Jews in Ukraine, Alpha created super expensive Holocaust memorial project. Yosef Zisels, one of the most respected Ukrainian Jewish leaders, called it part of Russia's hybrid war. Now, one slide I decided not to show, but I will tell you what. It's about one example of Alpha's relationships in the US. And the name of that relationship is Mr. Edward Mermerstein. Mr. Mermerstein is a luxury real estate lawyer and politician. As reported by Voice of America, he has helped oligarchs invest in New York, including in real estate. He is also on record in the paper called The Real Deal, which is all online, asserting that media claims about possible illegalities associated with foreign funding are largely ridiculous. And also on record explaining that the Kremlin annexed Crimea because, I quote, access to warm water ports is critical for Russia. Makes sense, right? I can't wait when Germany takes a piece of Italy for the same reason. He also claimed that Russian military was going to protect the Russian population in Crimea. Mr. Mermerstein directed New York office of a foundation of another Kremlin crony and Alpha business partner, Vexipert, who was later sanctioned. After that, he sat on UJA board. He is president of UJA subsidiary Cogeco that also received millions from Genesis Philanthropy and furthered its identity agenda, and also took part, I witnessed that, in silencing dissident voices. He is listed in one of Alpha Mail's lawsuits, actually in a lawsuit against Fusion GPS, among those who are likely to have discoverable information about quite a bit of their activities. All this right now online in the open access. Where is he now? He is now Commissioner for International Affairs in New York City Mayor's office, its primary liaison with the diplomatic community. He is the Anthony Blinken of the city of New York. Back to Alpha. They are very aggravated by sanctions, which sounds like they actually do affect them, contrary to those who claim that sanctions don't work. So in spare time from litigation, they reach out to some of the anti-Putin people that Ilya mentioned, those who left the country and get their signatures on the letter of support drafted by Western lawyers. They also take advantage of one of the leaders of Nobel Prize-winning Memorial that was legally disbanded by the Kremlin, Yelena Zhemkova, and Ilya Yashin, one of Russia's youngest opposition leaders, who just got a lengthy sentence and will soon be turning 40 in penal colony. What's common to all these people? They are likely to be better off with even slight shift in Russia toward the good cops, which is what Alpha is positioning itself to them. But most of this backfired. Navalny's lieutenant, Leonid Volkov, as Ilya mentioned, first denied signing any letter. Then Volkov admitted signing on behalf of their foundation and had to resign. Dmitry Muratov, another Russian Nobel Prize winner, also denies signing a letter about sanctions. He only wrote in support of one of Friedman's projects, and yet something different is posted online with his signature, whether real or forged. Zhimkova and Memorial published a disclaimer that her letter did not represent the organization and was not about sanctions, but about, again, Avan's support for a specific project. What happens next? Last week, police comes for searches and interrogations to Memorial's key leaders and to its office, and make them witness in a criminal case on exoneration of Nazism. One of the favorite topics, by the way, of the charities, philanthropies funded by Alpha. May these two events be connected between themselves? I'll leave this as a question mark. But the end result is a serious damage to that other Russia that we'd like to see prevail, because Zhimkova, Yashin, Muratov are among the most credible and respected Russians internationally. And from the strategic point of view, Alpha may very well be the most harmful among Putin's current. So to conclude, I hope that democratic governments and human rights NGOs will look into this situation and think how to protect disadvantaged people and groups from Alpha's Western lawyers chasing them for letters of support, and also how to find ways to mitigate some of the harmful consequences of Alpha's international activities. Okay, guys, thank you for your attention. Now we are moving our focus to another part of the world. I'm very pleased to give the floor to Dr. Nathan Nguyen. He is adjunct professor of criminal justice at the University of Houston downtown. His research areas include law enforcement, anti-corruption, and national constitution. He is also president of Vietnam Democracy Center, and on top of that, captain with the Houston Police Department.
And good morning, everyone. We share the common bond with the Russian people in the seeking freedom and democracy. So my topic is about the anti-corruption that being used as a tool for political complicity. The recent forced resignation of Vietnam President Nguyen Xuân Phúc, accused of corruption, has raised the question of how communist and authoritarian countries deal with this issue. We will explore how Vietnam carry out their anti-corruption process to remove their unwanted government official. In a democracy such as the United States, corruption is dealt with through a due process according to the Constitution. On the other hand, countries with one-party systems such as Communist Party and authoritarian regimes such as Russia, there is no check and balance. The recent event in Vietnam, including President Nguyen Xuân Phúc resignation, is apparently the result of his two deputy alleged corruption. Officially, this is all happening in the name of fighting corruption, but is indicative of power struggle at the top of the party, which permit no challenge to its monopoly on power. Initially, Vietnam used the fight against COVID-19 to project a positive image of their control over the disease to the Western media and to give legitimacy to the authoritarian model. The real corruption in Vietnam is the Vietnamese Communist government arbitrarily locked down anyone suspicious of being infected with COVID-19, resulting in a high number of deaths in 2021. These deaths could have been prevented if due process or proper medical evaluation were conducted. Furthermore, anyone dare to speak up against this atrocious policy is immediately snatched away. Invariably, in its 2021 Press Freedom Index, the Reporter Without Borders ranked Vietnam as very serious at 174 out of 180 countries, one of the lowest ranking in the world. In conclusion, to prevent the use of anti-corruption as a political complicity, we stand with freedom-loving people in the world include your country, Dmitry, Russia, to promote the establishment of democratic, multi-party system of representative government that are accountable to people. Thus, if government officials are being held accountable, they will be more likely to carry out the due process is promulgated in their constitution. So if anything I want to get out of this conversation is corruption. Corruption, to fight corruption, you need to have a due process rather than just to an arbitrary reason. And that's all I have. Thank you for this opportunity to participate with this very important topic.
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. I just think how the Soviet dissident movement and human rights fighters also emphasized follow your own constitution, observe your own laws to begin with when they were speaking to the regime. And that resonates in other parts of the world. Now, the floor is to Mr. Hai Cao. He is a researcher on Vietnam and vice president of Dai Viet National Party, which is one of two major Vietnamese political parties in exile. Mr. Cao has been a featured speaker on several national and international conferences, most recently at Texas Tech University's Vietnam Center and Sam Johnson's Vietnam Archive.
Good morning, everyone. First, I would like to thank you, Dimitri, for providing us this forum to further expose the corruption in the Vietnam under the leadership of the Vietnam Communist Party to the world. First of all, I just want to, dovetail into my previous speaker and fellow countryman, Nathan Nguyen, saying about the corruption of the VCP, Vietnam Communist Party. My presentation is specifically to give you details about the corruption is from the top down to the bottom of the VCP. Everywhere in Vietnam, for the last 50 years, since 1975, the corruption started all over. If you go to Vietnam, as you walk into the Tan Son Nhất International Airport, I'm talking about the Vietnamese, they are very selective. They know that if you're a foreigner, they would not demand demand money from you. But if a Vietnamese, they start asking for money. If you don't give them money, you can be like, giving all kind of trouble. And all the way up to the top of the party, the general secretary or the president. And for that reason, Nathan said that you can't really clean up or do it right because it's a monopoly of the VCP, and there's no check and balance, there's no penalty, and more importantly, you have to do as the system required to get advanced in the society. For example, no matter how good you are, you can't get a job as a university professor if you're not a member of the VCP and you are not prepared to bribe all the way up. But that's the general condition of the VCP in the society. But I'll bring to the perfect case that was like, very upset to the people is a particular case of a company, very big company called Việt-Á Technology Corporation. It was it happened during pandemic in the early of 2020. Việt-Á is a very prominent company and it's colluded with the VCP to develop and manufacture domestically the COVID test. They name it RT-PCR. And within a month, they came out with the test. And because of that, they really get a market for themselves. But they also made the name, claim that the WHO, the World Health Organization, approved the test. So they sold it for like $20 a kit, a test kit. And it's so highly demand. And they receive a government award. But later on, during the in 2021, because of the discover that the cost they developed the test like 4 times more than the cost of the vaccine itself. It started for people to suspicious that something is going on, and the WHO by 2021 refuted the claim that they approved by the WHO, the test kit, and then the further investigation they found that each test kit was sold for $20. That's a lot of money for Vietnamese people. And later on, they changed it from manufacturing themselves, but they imported the test kit from China. And then they relabeled them as made in Vietnam under their name. They imported for 95 cents US dollar, less than $1. And they market it for same price, like a $20, $21. So needless to say, they profited from the pandemic of their own people, the Vietnamese people. And the result, they found it like they gave the government official and private all the way to like 177 million. And they themselves profit like $22 million during the entire pandemic by jacking up the margin to 45% to maximize the profit. That is the perfect example of corruption all the way up. So when they talk about cleaning up the government, cleaning up the VCP, responding to Transparency International, they will, cooperate it and bring it down and clean it up. And like recently, the General Secretary Nguyễn Phú Trọng, embarking a program that goes to clean it up. Frankly, everybody knows it's not really cleaning up. It's just like a means, like Nathan said earlier, it's to get rid of his opponent, political opponents. And just like any other authoritarian system or dictatorial or communist system, they just get rid of people that are different political belief than them. And that's going on. So to us, even people in Vietnam or the people who live in exile like me, we know that is there. Corruption is there, always will be there. But what about corruption? I just give you the example of corruption between a big company to the people and to the government. What about the Vietnamese overseas? These are the citizens of Vietnam who emigrated out temporarily on a working visa, working permit, resided or lived like scattered around the country. Around the world in different countries. For example, recently, the Vietnamese resided in Warsaw, Poland, had to protest the Vietnam embassy because they demanded money for even to do the paperwork required by the VCP. Like, when you were born or you get overseas, you had to have some paperwork. And in other words, the citizen went to the Vietnam embassy to do the required paperwork by their government, and the government demanded money for them to do that. Also, during the pandemic, if any overseas Vietnamese want to go back to Vietnam, they had to bribe to get a ticket from Vietnam Airlines, which officially the government sent it out free. Then if the VCP say, well, if you're Vietnamese, so we'll just take you home. But in reality, they made money out of the people. Now, how about the Vietnamese, what we call the anti-communist Vietnamese community, like me and many of other people, millions of people live overseas ever since 1975. While the VCP has issued many years ago, like close to like 20 years ago, they were called Resolution 36. What that is, they will use money, their money, and bribe the people overseas, the Vietnamese-speaking diaspora, to influence, divide, and control the people. How do they do that? They would send their TV station over to the most heavily concentrated Vietnamese speaking diaspora, the anti-communist community, Vietnamese community in area like Little Saigon, California, U.S., and other countries like Australia and Canada. And what they do is they just issue, and they have their program with fake news or propaganda. But to the elderly, the first generation of the Vietnamese people who came here many years ago, they didn't have the command of the English language. So they also, like, melancholy, they miss the music and all of the play in Vietnam, so they tune into that. So eventually they using those to influence fake news and spread government propaganda, communist propaganda. So that one way, the VCP Resolution 36 influenced the Vietnamese speaking diaspora. Another way is they exercise their Resolution 36 to control religions, different religions, domestically and overseas. They do the, they try to control Buddhism, they control Catholicism, but they are more successful with Buddhism because Catholicism, they started, but they're not very successful yet. But they would select a few, not a few, but select some young Buddhist monks developed in Vietnam, and they exported them out to overseas to heavily concentrated Vietnamese-speaking diaspora. And then those, well, we call them, the Vietnamese people overseas, call them Sư Quốc Doanh. So they will try to dissipate propaganda. They try to collect money from the Vietnamese-speaking diaspora. And then they started their own agenda to influence the people. And the third way that they are doing the implementation of their VCP Resolution 36 is using their tax money from their hard-earned people in Vietnam and using it to oversee corporation or worldwide program, and they funded, for example, one of the most prominent, another most prominent company is called Sovico Investment Group. It's a private health company in Vietnam. It's very, I would call conglomerate, because they in several different industries. They are in, like, you know, airline, they call Vietjet. They are in real estate and on, building and apartment. But see, recently, back in October, what they did was their CEO and founder, Mrs. Nguyễn Thị Phương Thảo, they will go to England, and they give England, and they pledge like, I can remember, like $150 million to Oxford University, and to change the college of Oxford University, Lincare, to Thảo College, her own. Now, how does she do that? Well, only crony and really close friend or member of the high-ranking VCP, member of CP, to enjoy those such a privilege. Or their purpose is to paint the picture that Vietnam is no longer communist. It's market-driven, very successful. Here is one successful female entrepreneur CEO. So there you go. Perfect example, right? In the meantime, there are so many poor people in Vietnam, but yet that's how they spend their money. They earn money to further their own questionable practice, and particularly bribery in the war stage. And another way that we like to conclude it is that what the message we would like to have the people to keep in mind, that, you know, in Vietnam, there is absolutely corrupted from the top to the bottom, every aspect of the society. That's guaranteed. And the only way to make the society clean is the country has to do away with monopoly, single party, and that's the Vietnam Communist Party, and have to have open election for multi-parties, and have to respect freedom, democracy, and the rule of law. That's the only way to clean up. So all of the facade of successful in capital and capital market, like the situation I just shared with you, Sovico, Vietjet, and all that, or Vietart, it just a front for them to further their atrocity and corruption of the country. So with that, I yield the floor back to Dimitri.
We're now going to the discussion part, and Gary will moderate that. Before I pass the floor to him, I want to remind that at the beginning, I propose that we dedicate this event to TI Russia and others who are fighting against repression. And by the way, we are privileged to have with us today, and that was not on the program, we have none other but the founder of TI Russia, who also held significant positions in TI Global, Elena Panfilova, that joins us all the way from Moscow, which is courageous for her. And given that her organization has to close there and has been branded as foreign agent for the past 8 years. So later, closer to the end, we'll hear her speak as well. And now the floor is to Gary.
Thanks, Dimitri. And why don't we, excuse me, why don't we take a couple of questions. We'll try and keep it as close to time as possible. But if there are questions from the audience, people should enter it into the chat. I saw we did have a question from Blair who had to leave, but just for others, I can certainly answer that and see if we have any other questions that come in. He did ask about whether or not our beneficial ownership law, the law that tries to counter the abuse of anonymous shell companies, would be retroactive, because I said when you can't start a new company unless, once this law kicks in, you can't start a new company unless you name your beneficial owner. The good news is, yes, it does. It is retroactive. Existing companies will have 2 years, I believe, once the law kicks in, to fill in reports, and then all companies, both previous companies or new companies formed after the law kicks in, will have to update those within, I think it's 30 or 60 days of any change of ownership. So there's the initial filing, and there are updates as well. Let me see. We don't have questions in the queue right now. But one question that I would ask a couple of the panelists, whoever feels they would like to answer this, is we did talk a lot about the problems and identifying the problems of foreign money crossing into the U.S. or other borders to influence in Europe or wherever. I'd be interested if any of the panelists have particular thoughts on solutions and what countries should do to protect themselves against this kind of foreign influence. Anybody care to?
I can quickly give 1 minute comment that obviously in the US we need to update laws and enforcement, especially on FARA, but also Logan Act on lobbying. But academic institutions should really set up their own due diligence processes, including including third-party expertise, independent expertise on donations. They should include native speaker, for example, in case of Russian money, Russian diaspora experts, or anyone understanding Russian financial and political system. The same goes for Gulf money, for Chinese money, for any other, kleptocratic and questionable money. Also, I highly recommend, everything I know about due diligence on donations, it's a fuzzy code imposed in each university on their own, pretty vague and rarely quantifiable, and rarely objective. It's usually just a circle of people, usually administrators and business development people, who are deciding it between themselves. So that's not democratic and not proper due diligence process. So there are easy solutions from a non-academic world which can be brought in. You don't have to invent, a wheel with this question. That's it for me.
Thank you. Going across on my screen, I think I saw Mr. Cao. Did you?
Yes, sir, Gary. I can only speak for the case of the Vietnam Communist Party. They use all sorts of money that they receive, like the report. I think from World Bank or IMF that they in 2022, the overseas people, Vietnamese overseas, sent home to Vietnam $19 billion. All right, and that overseas from U.S., from Australia, from Canada, and that accounted for the people who came to those countries for working, utilize the labor. They call that, working visa. But the point is, the VCP using those money against the Vietnamese speaking diaspora through Resolution 36, I just through explaining. How do we influence the flow, the inflow of money, and also the outflow of money to Vietnamese diaspora would be, my recommendation is be heavily scrutinized in everything they do. Just for example, that the donation like $175 million, $175 million for a name change to the college, while the country is so poor in their own country. So my humble opinion is, Western country, we are the democracy and freedom lover. We just need to make aware to the worldwide agency that not just because of humanity and give them money, but you have to have condition and monitor how they apply the fund or whatever money overseas. Thank you very much for listening to my 10 cents of idea.
Thank you. And Olga, you wanted to weigh in on this?
Yeah, very quickly. I think for starters, we need to follow the laws that we have on the books, and we need to actually put pressure on, you know, our agencies to follow through, because we saw, I mean, after last year's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, how quickly all the mechanisms to sanction everyone came into place pretty much within 24 hours. And we have to make it extremely painful for the enablers. And I'll give you one quick example. We have Yevgeny Prigozhin, who runs Wagner Mercenaries. Well, he's the public face of it. We know who runs it, but he's the public face. This mercenary group has conducted war crimes over the past decade across the globe. They were sanctioned by the United States. They were sanctioned by UK. And recently there was a scandal that broke out in the UK that in 2019, under sanctions, Prigozhin was able to use influence inside of UK's treasury in order to send a waiver to a law firm so he can sue Bellingcat in order for, defamation that he owns Wagner, which now he proudly flaunts. So now no one in treasury in the UK government has been held accountable. The law firm has not been held accountable. And you had a sanctioned individual who runs a terrorist organization from Moscow have the ability to wire money to sue journalists, weaponizing our own institutions against us, to silence Elliot Higgins. And that's it. So for starters, we need to make it extremely painful for the enablers, because without the enablers, if you remove them out of the factor, you're not going to have any of this. Probably 80% will be cut.
Thank you for those comments. Yes. And in fact, I should have mentioned briefly that there is actually a bill in the U.S. Congress right now, aptly named the Enablers Act, which would go after a lot of these lawyers and accountants, trust formation agents, and others that serve as the gateway to the U.S. financial system, and hoping that there's similar legislation abroad as well. I see, Ilya, you have, is that a hand or is that just an applause?
I just uploaded to the Enablers Act. I think it's really good.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. Hey, before we close out, I do want to recognize, as Dmitry did, Elena, who is with us from Russia, from Moscow. And so, Elena, we would love to have you close us out with some final words.
Thank you so much, Dmitry. Thank you so much, Gary. Thanks for organizing the event. And it's so great to see, Gary, you and Ilya. I mean, so long time no see, and yeah, kind of almost 15 years, right? I mean, doing this thing, and we're still discussing same topics, which probably send us to the answers to the question what to do. And yes, Russian government actually not only proclaimed TI Russia foreign agent in 2015. Just recently, Russian government made the whole Transparency International, which means, Gary, you too, undesirable organization, like aim transparency-related person is undesirable anymore in Russia, we would kind of totally ignore that, but unfortunately, being connected with undesirable organization or undesirable persons is criminal offense up to 10 years. Therefore, we had to close down Transparency International to protect our team. And that means that the team will continue to work, and we actually continue to work. And that brings me to the issue, actually, what to do, because even after all the announcements of recent sanctions against Transparency Russia came out, we published the report about with crypto, from Moscow with crypto with love, which is about using the crypto exchange places all over Moscow, all over Russia, actually to launder money to UK, to cash. And we're talking big money, meaning that there are yet another absolutely oversaw by sanctions way of going around through crypto, through all these exchange places. And the team of TI Russia continue works, and it will continue work and publish such reports. But the more we work, the more we understand that we started to talk about laundering the image by oligarchs and officials like 20 years ago. And maybe this time around, we indeed have to concentrate on enablers of different forms, and actually make the whole list of them, because it's so easy to say like, it's just lawyers. No, GR specialists, real estate specialists, crypto specialists, tourism specialists, because we collect a lot of types of enablers who, by selling a trip to Cyprus, actually gives them the gateway to escape all possible sanctions, which otherwise would be facing them in the countries of origin of their money. And I do think that we sometimes tend to, because it's a lot of corruption, and I honestly salute my Vietnamese colleagues, because I know that Vietnam was there. Transparency Vietnam had to leave the country at the same point, and we are not the only one who are now chapter in exile, and there are chapters in other countries which are actually expecting that to happen to them. In the former Soviet Union, we have several other chapters in the similar troublesome situation. But the thing is that we need not only cover everything, but sometimes to concentrate on something, because we kind of have the portrait of perpetrators. We covered quite extensively who they are and where their wealth comes from. But I think if we concentrate on how these oligarchs actually do this, who exactly approached Lena Zhemkova to write the letter. I want to know the name because obviously it wasn't neither Friedman nor Oven, right? There were some firm, reputable firm, and which is accepted in reputable houses. I want us to be very precise in concentrating without any hesitation on who are them, not just enablers by title, but by names. And that, I believe, would help. And it would help us, wherever we are going to work from, to actually at least to try to stop this enormous outflow of money, dirty money, corrupt money, which is destroying, sometimes literally, in recent 1 year and 1 month, literally destroying human lives, but also on the distance, destroying reputations, of universities, people, and that can have a prolonged effect of sleeping bomb. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena. And we, again, appreciate your comments, your courage, and moving forward and figuring out how TI Russia continues to try and do its valuable work, and we stand in solidarity with you. Dmitry, let me turn it back to you for any final words.
No final words. I think you hear me, right?
Yes.
Yes. No, I think that Yelena's summed it up. And I just want to thank Gary enormously and the Vietnamese team, David and others, for collaborating on this event. I think it was interesting and useful, and we'll publish the recording once we process it. So I just want to thank everyone for being with us. If Gary or David want to say something, please do. But other than that, we'll adjourn. And you'll all have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you, Dmitry. Thank you, Gary.
Thank you, Elena. And we, again, appreciate your comments, your courage, and moving forward and figuring out how TI Russia continues to try and do its valuable work, and we stand in solidarity with you. Dmitry, let me turn it back to you for any final words.
I think that Yelena's summed it up, and I just want to thank Gary enormously and the Vietnamese team, David and others, for collaborating on this event. So I just want to thank everyone for being with us. We'll adjourn, and you'll all have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you, Dmitry. Thank you, Gary.